I won't pay any attention to you. But my name's Kent Andersen. I'm at Birmingham Southern College. I am an English instructor there. I'm the director of our Hess Center for Leadership and Service. I'm the chair of our Engaged Learning programs, which serves as it's service learning, study abroad, those kinds of things. And most recently, the president called me the institutional Pollyanna. So I don't know if that's an official title or not.
I'm Richard Galentino, and I own my own company and do consulting for healthcare and education institutions, including Vanderbilt.
And I'm Billy Wells, Vice President for Executive Affairs at the University of North Georgia. I do government relations, international programs, and community engagement.
So the focus of our study today is at Rhodes. We assume you know a little bit about Rhodes, but probably a quick background is Rhodes is a liberal arts institution located in Memphis. It's about 1,900 undergraduate students, most of whom live on campus. And the focus of our study is on the scholarship of engagement. We're going to talk you through a bit, first of all, the context a little bit more about Rhodes that's relevant for our study, some of the literature relevant for our study, our questions, how we answered those questions, what we found, some overarching conclusions that we can come to, and then some recommendations that we have for Rhodes concerning the scholarship of engagement and faculty participation in the scholarship of engagement.
Walking on the campus of Rhodes, we were immediately aware of the vision, which was clearly demarcated several places around the campus. And Rhodes College aspires to graduate students with a passion for learning, a compassion for others, and the ability to translate that academic study and personal concern into effective leadership, and to place that leadership in their communities, particularly Memphis, and the world.
And a lot of this momentum stems back from President Strout's inauguration in 2000, where he put forward the 10 steps to advance Rhodes. That included a significant involvement in the Memphis community. The Board of Trustees approved the vision Richard just showed you in 2003. Then they achieved their Carnegie elective classification in 2006 as a community engaged campus. They followed that with a grant that they received from Teagle, a community-based learning grant, and that created the Community Integrative Education Working Group, which we worked with extensively during this project. Their QEP in 2009 involved fellowships for community engagement, which gave them additional momentum. And then in 2010 and 2011, they were named the #1 service institution by Newsweek. Most recently, they established the Memphis Center as a focal point for most of their external programs.
Building on that relationship with Memphis, 75% of the students are involved in service learning in the community of Memphis, or I'm sorry, 80%, and 75% are engaged in internships. And there's a whole host of different programs that enable students to get engaged in Memphis, including programs that have been around since the 50s, the Kenny program. There's the Bonner Scholars Program, which is a national AmeriCorps program that they're a part of. And then there's also specific programs to Rhodes, the Rhodes Institute for Regional Studies, Learning Quarters, which mirror economic empowerment zones, and even special attention towards music, and the Mike Herb Institute for Music. And these programs bring students and faculty to a whole host of community partners that range from small church-related health clinics to large health systems to the mayor's office to local schools. So it's a full array of different community organizations that are involved in it.
That's right. And the concerns at Rhodes to try to connect with the community, engage with the community, echoes a larger scholarly conversation about the public purposes of higher education. In particular, the Carnegie classification system has an elective classification called the Community Engagement Classification. And they define community engagement as, or just think it describes the collaboration between institutions of higher education and their larger communities, local, regional, state, national, and global, for the mutual beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. Institutions can earn this elective classification for student engagement, for faculty engagement, or for both. And Rhodes actually has this elective classification for both, and they earned it in 2006. They were part of the initial group that will earn this elective classification and intend to renew in the next cycle.
Another important component of the scholarly conversation we built upon Boyer's work was the importance of scholarship of application, discovery, integration, and teaching at Rhodes, all four.
Because Boyer was in part interested in expanding the notion of what qualifies or counts as scholarly work, and sort of capturing more of the work that faculty actually do. In 1996, his original report was done in 1990, In 1996, he changes the scholarship of application to the scholarship of engagement and argues that scholarship of engagement means connecting the rich resources of the university to our most pressing social, civic, and ethical problems. O'Meara and Rice, in their discussion of broader domains of scholarship, talk about the scholarship of engagement in this way. They say it requires going beyond the expert model that often gets in the way of constructive university-community collaboration. It calls on faculty to move beyond outreach, asks scholars to go beyond service with its overtones of noblesse oblige. What it emphasizes is genuine collaboration, that the learning and the teaching be multidirectional and expertise shared. In short, when we're talking about the scholarship of engagement, we're talking about using disciplinary knowledge to address matters of urgent public concern, usually with or in collaboration with members outside the academy, with individuals outside the academy.
Okay. All this contextual information leads us to the purpose of our study, which is to support Rhodes in its efforts to fulfill its very distinctive institutional mission, particularly the aspect of engagement with the Memphis community, and also to prompt some additional reflection on their part with regard to the scholarship of engagement, which leads us to our project questions.
And we had 3 overarching project questions. The first one was, to what extent do faculty members at Rhodes participate in the scholarship of engagement? The second one looked at how and why faculty members choose to participate in community-based research and community-based learning, and how it is that decisions shaped by individual, organizational, environmental factors. And then the third question had to deal with the issue of reciprocity, and we looked at how do community partners view community-based research and learning at Rhodes. Each of these questions had multiple sub-questions, and I'm just going to highlight the underlines, which the second bullet part, one sub-question in particular looked at the value of participation, and then, as we alluded to earlier, the broader definition of scholarship. The second question, again, multiple sub-questions, and I just want to highlight that we will touch upon the reward structures at Rhodes, as well as a shared language by faculty as well as community members with regard to scholarship. And then the third question had to do with community members and reciprocity and their prioritization.
So all of our questions are informed by a single conceptual model. And Diamond and Adam in 1995 basically take up Boyer's challenge to think about how to get faculty involved in multiple forms of scholarship, convene disciplinary organizations to identify and ultimately understand what are the factors that influence faculty work. And they identify 6. And those include the institutional priorities and values, your departmental priorities and values, reward structures, your personal priorities and interests, as well as your disciplinary and professional values, and your available time and resources. We supplement this model with some specific concepts directly from the literature concerning community engagement and faculty involvement in community-based work. So here's their model again with some additional concepts on top of it. When O'Meara talks about community-based work, she's interested in 3 factors that they basically overlay with Diamond and O'Meara's. She's interested in individual factors on the one hand, institutional factors, which she captures institutional priorities, departmental priorities, and formal and informal statements about promotion and tenure, and then what she labels environmental factors. So what you can draw from your discipline or what you can draw from your environment. Informing both of those is the concept of reciprocity in your relationship to community partners. That's one resource that you have for engaging in community-based work, as well as what she labels the values of the engaged American scholar. That's basically an epistemological orientation, a way of thinking about knowledge that informs or supports faculty engagement in community-based work. So we tried to look at these factors at Rhodes.
Conceptual model drives our project design and methods. Next slide. Question 1, we used a quantitative approach for the survey to measure the extent of faculty participation. We sent it to 150, all the faculty member, and we got 30 to 44 usable cases, depending on the measures that you're actually looking at. We had composite measures with regard to participation, and also composite measures with regard to the value placed on the various aspects below. We also collected demographic data with regard to the faculty as well. Next slide. Question 2, we used a qualitative approach with interviews of 38 faculty and staff, including individuals involved in community-based work. We also interviewed some of those who were not involved in that work. And we identified themes through our analytical induction process. Question 3, we did interviews of 6 community partners that had ongoing relationships with the Rhodes faculty. That leads us to our findings.
So this first table basically shows us frequency of participation in the different forms of scholarship and scholarly activities that we measured. And the first one over there on the left is scholarship of engagement. And you can see here the first 1 actually means none. So in our response categories, 1 equals none. And the other ones are 1 to 2 times, 3 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times, and 5 or more times. So you can see that about half the faculty in the last 3 years have participated, that answered our survey, have participated in the scholarship of engagement in the last 3 years. Right? That's similar to their participation in the scholarship of application. The difference in those forms is that the scholarship of engagement emphasizes the notion of reciprocity and partnership with the community partner. Application emphasizes the application of disciplinary knowledge to some public issue or public problem or an institutional problem. Slightly more than that are participating in community-based teaching. So you can actually see some slightly more faculty are participating in community-based teaching. That includes things like a service learning course or community integrated course, directing a fellowship in the community or an internship in the community, things like that. Still more faculty than that, although not up into the higher range, but more are participating in institutional service and service to the lay public. That might include things like serving on a curriculum review committee. It could include being an expert witness or things like that, but only 16.7% hadn't done one of those activities in the last 3 years. By far the greatest participation that we found in our survey among the scholarship and scholarly activities that we measured, however, was in teaching in general. So this included things like developing a new class activity or thinking about strategies that would improve students' development or critical thinking skills. And so that's a number of activities there. You can see this is by far the highest participation that we found in terms of where faculty are spending their time among the scholarship and scholarly activities that we measured. This table basically it's in your summary. You can take a look at it. It tells you what measures we used and what some of the results were and what the findings were.
After looking at participation, which Ken just went over with you, then we looked at the scholarship of engagement and the scholarship of application with regard to the value that faculty have there. And we looked at individual, departmental, and institutional levels for that value. So we found that faculty value the scholarship of engagement at roughly 60%, and that increased to 90% for scholarship of application. As Ken just mentioned, part of the reason was, the propositions that make up each of those composite scores had different underlying questions. And so again, for engagement, those questions revolved around community impact and reciprocity, and with scholarship of the application, it very much looked at theory to practice. Interestingly, we found that when faculty members were asked, what value do your departmental colleagues hold with respect to the scholarship of engagement, it was significantly lower. So it went from 60 to 25%. And we also saw this lower amount with regard to the scholarship of application. So again, when individual faculty members were asked about their departmental colleagues, they felt that their departmental colleagues had significantly lower value placed on scholarship of engagement and application. However, when looking at the institution, they felt like the institution does have a high value placed on the scholarship of engagement as well as the scholarship of application. So in short, we want to highlight this misalignment, or just highlight the difference between individual, institution, and departmental value placed on both scholarship of engagement and application. We'll come back to that in our conclusions and recommendations. And this is a summary slide of what we just went over.
Moving into the values placed on the broader view of scholarship by the faculty, note that the individual values toward a broader view of scholarship parallel the faculty values regarding the scholarship of engagement and that of application briefed by Richard. The accountability response reinforces this as well. Moving on down to the departmental perception, it also parallels those for engagement that Richard briefed. However, interestingly, in this particular assessment, the institutional value is significantly less than the value placed on the scholarship of engagement, and mirrors the departmental percentages. The reason for this seeming disconnect is that the composite measures that were used for this item focused on questions at the institutional level related to promotion and tenure, and the promotion and tenure composition of individuals on that body, and rather than leadership of the institution as a whole. So there's a difference.
Again, a summary slide of those general findings available in your packet. So in our interviews, we interviewed, recall, 38 faculty members. We interviewed actually a number of faculty members, some staff members involved with community-based work, as well as one administrator involved in community-based work. Mostly faculty members, both tenured and untenured. And we identified 4 themes that basically grew out of those interviews. The first theme is that there's an emphasis on quality teaching, and that's what shapes participation in community-based work. In other words, faculty want to place students in the community to help them learn better, to think more critically, to see the relationship between what they're doing. I think teaching is the thing without which, right? So it's a high individual value, but also a high institutional value recognized across the institution. The second theme that emerged from our interviews was that the values of the engaged American scholar shape participation in community-based work. In particular, the desire to integrate teaching, research, and service roles. So the faculty we spoke with saw those as integrated activities and wanted to see them as complementing one another and supporting one another. Right? Likewise, they wanted to have an impact on their students, an impact on the discipline, but also an impact on the community and on their relationship with Rhodes. And finally, they valued mutual benefit with their community partners. They wanted to have a mutual back and forth with their partner. And so those were the values of the engaged American scholar, and those shape participation in community-based work, whether it's community-based learning or community-based scholarship.
In many ways, theme 3, I think, is the center of gravity for the study. Misalignment between institutional priorities and promotion and tenure guidelines may hinder participation. That first quote, I think, there says it quite well. If I was advising somebody untenured, I'd say don't do it. I'm not sure it's going to pay off in front of a promotion and tenure committee or on a dean's letter. It's a very telling comment. Theme 4, let me back up for a second. So theme 3 has a little underlying something, I would say, and that's one aspect of that is that there's not yet a shared language for discussion of community-based research. And it's very difficult to fix that part if you don't have a common language to help you articulate it. Theme 4, disciplinary differences shape participation. We kind of figured this out before we rolled into Rhodes, but I think our study bears that out, that if you're in the social science, you might have more opportunity than in another field, perhaps, as an example. Next slide.
So this table is a lot of text, but what it shows you is how our themes cut across the 6 factors identified by Diamond and Adam. So the left column over there are the 6 factors identified by Diamond and Adam. The next bar is O'Meara's 3 categories that influence faculty participation in community-based work. That next column is the questions we asked and we posed to our interviewees. And this last column is how our themes cut across those. An important aspect for Diamond and Adam is that those factors influence one another to influence faculty work. So in fact, our themes cut across those 6 factors.
And that's in your packet for reference. Also, as mentioned earlier, we interviewed 6 community partners, and we found 4 overarching themes with all of those partners. The first theme that was overarching was that students benefit from their work and in the community. So students benefit from community engagement relationship. And we saw over and over, people gave accounts of individual students growing personally as well in their study during their course of work with a community partner. The second theme was that community organizations really benefit from students being engaged in their organization. And we saw this from assistance at the clerical level to research level. So there's a wide range of services being provided by students, and the community organizations really felt that they benefit. So students help with anything we have going on. They update our website, do office work, and research. The third overarching theme was that Rhodes is making a deliberate effort over the last decade to really be engaged in the community. And the community members voiced that over and over. So while we heard that from the faculty, we also heard that from the community members. The fourth theme was very interesting, and it was that the community members have a very different language when they're describing the work of Rhodes students and faculty. And it's very much a language of service and volunteerism as opposed to a language of scholarship engagement.
That leads us to our conclusions. We developed 5 overarching conclusions as a result of the study. The first is that the faculty, we surveyed very much place a high value on the quality of teaching both individually and institutionally. Not unexpected for a good liberal arts institution. Rhodes' efforts to connect with Memphis and the surrounding community are recognized and valued. No doubt about that. We found that every time we talk with folks. The emerging value set of the engaged American scholar is setting the stage for supporting community-based work. That's the value set that Kent mentioned previously. There is a misalignment between the departmental values and promotion and tenure guidelines on one side and the stated institutional mission and individual personal and professional values on the other. To me, and once again, I think that's the center of gravity for the entire study. Faculty members at Rhodes do not have a consistent language. We mentioned that previously. If you're going to articulate something in a document or in a set of standards or whatever, you have to have a common language so you understand one another.
So those conclusions lead us to some recommendations, and we draw our recommendations from all of the literature, but we primarily draw on two sources. One of those is O'Meara and Rice's discussion of faculty priorities reconsidered and rewarding multiple forms of scholarship, as well as Beer, Votruba, and Wells becoming an engaged campus. And they're actually building on the notion of the Carnegie Engaged classification and offering tools and techniques for institutions to move towards that classification and build themselves their identity as an engaged campus. So a lot of our conclusions, our recommendations rather, are drawn from these sources of literature.
We developed 5 total recommendations, and Kent and others will talk a little bit about those in a second. But basically, they revolve around promotion and tenure guidelines, the tools for documenting and evaluating scholarship, which would be key to those guidelines, the ability to have open forums and campus conversations to socialize and build support for this continued momentum with regard to community-based work, and then the mechanisms to train new and existing faculty, in other words, to socialize them into the community-based focus of the institution. And then finally, we did not really study this extensively, but we believe they can increase their opportunities for faculty to connect with the community.
So a little bit more about recommendation 1 is we recommend promotion and tenure guidelines that reflect the institutional mission. And in our recommendation, we actually point to both the scholarship of engagement and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Now, it's important to note that the scholarship of teaching and learning wasn't an initial focus of our study. But as you saw on the initial slide, it's where they're spending a lot of their time. And when we did our interviews, they talk about it a lot. And they talk about the value of teaching. But we were also hearing that it doesn't count. And so people were telling us that if you do pedagogy type stuff, it doesn't really qualify. So it seems to us to match their institutional mission, they need to advance that. That will also help integrate their teaching, research, and service roles and deal with some workload issues that they might have. The second recommendation, this is still me, the second recommendation deals with the tools for documenting and evaluating the multiple forms of scholarship. In other words, you can decide that they're important, but what they also didn't have was a way of talking about how to document that work and think about how that work might be done. So what they need is instruments, assessment instruments that can cut across multiple forms of scholarship, but also respect disciplinary differences, right? And so we point them to some materials that might help them do that. They spent a lot of time thinking about the notion of peer review, came up regularly in our interviews, and how to broaden the notion of peer review. Has to do with the values of the engaged American scholar and expanding what qualifies or counts as a member of the peer review process and thinking about community partners. And so the National Review Board for the Scholarship of Engagement can help them think about some of those tools as well, right? And how to broaden that notion of peer review.
The third recommendation had to do with holding open forums on campus and really inviting people into this conversation with respect to the scholarship of engagement and really all 4 forms of scholarship. And we believe that by having these open forums, we'll start to develop a common language that all faculty members will share in. We also think it would be important to invite community members on campus to be a part of some of these conversations so they start sharing that language with the faculty. And then the last bullet point, we also think that as part of this dialogue, there really needs to be ongoing discussion with regard to reward structures and disciplinary differences, and we heard that both from faculty members and community partners. The fourth recommendation looks at deliberate ways to really socialize new faculty. And the institution, we think this is important at the institutional level, but also at the departmental level. So there's multiple ways that we thought that junior faculty could be mentored with regard to all forms of scholarship, which would be important in the tenure and promotion process. emphasize the institutional vision with new faculty members, and again, really make a deliberate effort to conscientize the socialization process for new faculty with regard to scholarship and how it's counted at Rhodes.
Our final recommendation had to do with increasing opportunities for the faculty to connect with the community. And we looked at a couple of different things. We really kind of focused on the recommendation to help faculty create cooperative networks within the community. There are a number of different approaches to that. Faculty, staff, and students could participate in civic organizations. They can invite community members on campus for various functions or forums. And then the last bullet there is something that we didn't really focus on in terms of institutional resources, but we did hear faculty comment throughout our work regarding resources and institutional support. Institutional support could help identify the partners in the community, promote and disseminate work the faculty has done, assist with grant writing, legal assistance, and other technical areas that might facilitate their work.
So we conclude with the vision of Rhodes, which is to aspire students with a passion for learning, a compassion for others, and the ability to translate academic study and personal concern into effective leadership and actions in their community, in Memphis, and the world.
Throughout this, both in one of your recommendations and then your measurement of the level of performance, is that you make a distinction but never describe it between scholarship and scholarly activity. I think it's a very fundamental difference.
You are absolutely right. In fact, it was a slide that we cut because we were afraid of time. So the distinction that Braxton's talking about is the difference between scholarly activities and scholarship, right? And so when we're talking about scholarship, it's something that's going to be publicly available, amenable to critique, and usable or transportable for other sort of available for exchange by other scholars, right? Which is different from scholarly activities, which might draw on one's professional discipline or disciplinary expertise. So that's why the teaching activities we saw is an example of scholarly activities, but not the scholarship of teaching and learning. So we didn't have any measures in our survey for publications or even unpublished outcomes that we could describe as scholarship. So every time I look at our table that tells us about the scholarly activities and scholarship, I feel like I have blinders on because there's a lot of things I can't see in terms of what they're producing in terms of scholarship or scholarly activities.
Now, in your interviews with the faculty, did you get that they were trying to make a case for their scholarly activities to be counted as scholarship?
No.
So you didn't get that sense
Yeah,
at
it was
all?
a
that
mixed
they were-
bag, pretty much. I mean, one of the discussion points was it really crosses into all three areas: service, scholarship, and teaching, and defining where it best fits depending on what the activity is. We discussed that.
I talked to one faculty member who she's ready to go. She's going to be up for tenure, and she had a new book that was coming out and lots of things that would be peer-reviewed disciplinary work. But she sort of made a triangle. And she said, but I produce a lot of other reports, government reports, reports for partners that she works with. She's like, none of that counts. Those would qualify as unpublished scholarly outcomes. So she was interested in that tier, but not necessarily. She would still see she could see her teaching sort of feeding into that. She worked with students to produce those reports and so on.
So she didn't conflate that with scholarship, but rather she regarded it as not a piece of scholarship, but rather more a scholarly activity then.
Yeah. That's the way she proceeded by the institution, but she thought they were more important. She actually seemed frustrated. She grabbed a whole stack of reports that she'd done and said, all this stuff doesn't count for me, only my book does.
I have one other question, and then I'm sure there are other kinds of questions other people will have, is that in academics, there's a real attempt to try to measure the impact of people's work, through citations is one of the main measures of it. And I'm wondering, what would be the analog to this? Do you think citations would work with the scholarship of engagement, or do you think there might be some other way another type of way of assessing the impact of a person's work?
That's a tough one. I think, if I may, it varies with the project.
Please,
Very much. Yes, sir. I think it varies with the project very much. You could, if it's a study for a government agency, it could have significant results in terms of amount of money saved, as an example.
We also heard from the community partners of the impact, so maybe there's a way to measure from the community partners. In Memphis, there's St. Jude's Hospital. They certainly felt a large impact of faculty members and gave specific examples of things that people were doing that maybe were scholarly activities but not scholarship. But there might be a way to measure the impact from the perspective of the community partner.
I think there were a lot of other comments that we encountered, at least I did, and I think Ken probably did too, as well as alternative forms of peer review and how that's really done, or could be done.
Yeah, and so one of the things that Beer and Vertruba recommend, actually, is that if you've got clear guidelines for assessing the kinds of scholarship, you'd want to get a community partner in, or somebody else from, say, from another institution in on the beginning of your project, rather than waiting until the end of your project to see whether it's good. In other words, they can help assess it all the way along the line. So that would give a sense of the quality of the project, as well as the relevance or importance for the literature and for the community partner they might be working with.
I think this is tremendously smart, well done, interesting. I have two quick questions. One has to do with whether or not you followed Braxton and his colleagues in differentiating in your results the high consensus, low consensus fields in your findings. I didn't see very much attention to that.
We did. We didn't get a lot from we ran t-tests on all of our composite measures based on including high and low consensus domains, but also gender, tenure status, and another one.
Didn't find much.
Yeah, we didn't find much. There was one difference in terms of low consensus domains did perceive their departmental colleagues as valuing the scholarship of engagement more than high consensus domains.
Okay.
But we didn't find differences in terms of level of participation in scholarship.
What did you make of that you didn't, and is that consonant with what Braxton found?
It's not that the differences in participation is different from what Braxton and crew, whichever crew it is that follows it.
We'll discuss that. Right? That's a finding.
Yeah, we do it. It's in the report.
Okay.
Right? It's in the report. But I think that they're perceiving their colleagues as valuing it tends to reinforce that there's something to it, right? Our response rate, we didn't have a lot of people in our survey, as you saw.
I have a question and a comment, and so thank you very much for the interesting presentation, and I've learned a lot. So the first comment is, your last comment was about the response rate. I felt that you glossed over that fact. You don't even calculate a response rate, and the way in which you talk about your findings seem to suggest a level of confidence that may not be there. So can you talk a little bit about that? For example, you don't use the language of those who responded, 60% said. So what level of confidence do you have that these 28 people, who are they, why, and what is the fact that only 28 responded out of 150? What does that tell you about engagement? So the number of questions and ways to think about it, and of course the most obvious one is, did you do the non-response bias, and what did you find?
So,
I have a subsequent question. Thank you.
okay, so you're right about our lower response rate. We did demographically, they look very similar. The people that did respond look very similar to what we know about the rest of the population, right? So they look similar in that way. And we did do. There were two. The request to complete the survey came from the provost. So we did do a wave test to see if there were differences in responses. There weren't differences in responses based on when someone replied. We also looked at completion rate to see if there were differences in who completed it. My suspicion initially was that our questions about the values of engaged American scholars scared some people off, but there didn't seem to be any relationship between completing the first sets of questions about participation level and completion rate. Right? So there didn't seem to be that. Don't know if I've answered all your questions.
I mean, you didn't even get very many who started the survey.
Right.
I think that was a learning. I think we would, we followed the client's advice on how to administer the survey, and I think we probably would, in hindsight, do it differently. We'd probably try to
Follow
deliver.
my advice. I'm
What?
just kidding.
What's that?
We'd probably try to deliver a paper survey at a captive audience, but our client suggested using their Qualtrics system, so we did that. And
I have another response too, which is I had the same fear that you did. When I first saw our response rate, I said, this is no good. Like, we can't use any of this. We don't have enough people that replied to us. And I went back to our client. I was on campus doing some interviews, and I went to our client, our main client contact, and I said, Bob, what do you, like, I don't think this is any good. And Bob said, this is good enough for what we need. He was really more interested in the intervention that we're getting in terms of helping them reflect on and think about the problems on their
Goes back to
campus.
the purpose of the study.
Right? So that was what mattered to him more than having all of the perfectly generalizable across institutions kind of answer. Instead, he wanted some information that would help him think and reflect and help his faculty think and reflect about that problem. So eventually, the short version of that is my client was satisfied with our response rate.
Which actually raises some really interesting things about the differences between so-called scholarship and scholarly activity and engagement, and the fact that a lot of it is client-driven, and that once you've satisfied a client, is that enough for that kind of intellectual work?
And also,
So,
but what
I
is
think it's
your
really
role?
interesting.
Yes, but what is your role to tell
The
them
welfare of the client.
about the limits? Because you used the word generalize. What did you say?
Well,
Generalize across
one of our
institutions?
limitations is, I don't want to, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. So one of the limitations in our report is precisely that we had
But
a
what do
low
you mean
response
across
rate.
institutions? I think
He wasn't interested whether we could generalize our findings from here to, I guess my upshot is that he's just interested whether, you're going to ask me whether we can generalize to the population,
What's your population?
the 150 or so faculty at Rhodes.
Which isn't, okay,
Right.
that's what I wanted to make sure. I have another question, if you could look at table A1 slide. It's a little bit more conceptual for me. All right, I thought it'd be an easy one. Okay, I was just wondering why institutional service and service to the lay public are combined, and why wouldn't it make more sense to separate them out to really understand scholarship of application to the institution? I think would be different than scholarship of application outside of the institution.
So we borrowed that measure from Braxton, Lucky, and Healand. And application, as they define it, refers to the use of disciplinary knowledge to address public or institutional problems. So they are combined forms of scholarship of application. There's only 2 items in that composite measure that actually address service to the lay public. The majority of them address institutional service.
But what do you think? How does this, for me, when I heard that, this was confusing, because I could see why it's high, because faculty have to do institutional service. But to get at engagement outside of what you're kind of required to do, I'm curious about what your voice
That's a
would
good
be about
question.
that.
I think, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to divide it as much as you can so you can zero in and get better resolution on what the impact is or what they're actually doing. I mean, I would agree with that.
I will say that the 2 items that talk about service to the lay public are not, they don't echo the engagement measures. There's 12 items in the engagement measure. Those all really emphasize reciprocity with someone else. Where one of the, I can't remember both of the items, one of them is serving as an expert witness. So it's not necessarily collaborative in the way that we're defining scholarship of engagement. So it would be interesting to pull it out to see in what ways are they doing some outreach. So I would define that as outreach rather than engagement. So it would be worth pulling
In
that
the,
out.
in the context,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
well, as Rhodes continually wants to differentiate itself in this space, it might make sense for them.
That's what
Right.
Well, when you're talking about the scholarship of engagement, where you're not looking at particular things like doing a study for a local governmental agency or a lay, non-academic lay society, whatever, those were the types of things you were talking about. Whereas I think with application, I don't know quite how you're conflating the 2 as making them the difference, because we included those kinds of measures, but they were more what we call the unpublished but publicly observable forms of scholarship. But then we had items that were actually publications where people would be talking about having a journal article where they reported the results of some applied study that they've done.
Right.
And so that, I think there's a real key difference here between, how the 2 terms are being used. And I think you got to be real careful along with Professor Goldberg's comment, because if you're going to use the 2 terms, you got to be very carefully differentiating them, I think.
two things. I'm amused by the definition of generalizability.
I wish I hadn't used that word.
Yeah, that's why I was.
That's
Yeah.
exactly correct.
No,
Yes, he did. There's arrogance here about the definition of generalizability coming from the scientific world as applicable to the world of practice.
Yeah, okay.
And there is a definition of generalizability in the world of practice. If they tried to lay it to us, we would become immediately disgruntled with a big way. So I think what you're getting here is a tension between definitions of these terms that are equally viable in different worlds. So I would say you're exactly right. The second thing, though, is a comment, and I think this Rhodes story, I think, is the best example we've had of the interaction between university and practice, because President Trout is a higher ed graduate from this institution. And before he took the Rhodes job, he took a year off. And he came back here as a visiting scholar. He didn't teach, but he spent the year engaged in the academic community, learning and refreshing himself and growing. And he laid out that platform that he took to Rhodes in that year that he came back. So it's a really wonderful story that you guys end up going there to see.
Yeah, he was president of Belmont before he went to Rhodes.
Time for other questions?
Yes.
So first, I really enjoyed this. We've seen other capstone presentations on Rhodes, and it's really nice to sort of complement
Yes,
the work on student life
series
with
of them.
faculty and academic questions. I want to talk a little bit about, you talked in your, both your questions and your recommendations about reward structures, about, in most of your analysis is at the institutional level. I'm wondering about the professions and disciplines, and to what extent there are tensions between and among those, to which making recognition simply at the institutional level is not enough. Did any of that come out in your discussion and interviews with faculty about the tensions between the professions and the demands of their discipline and the institutional mission?
Yes, I mean, was it 38 interviews? Exhausting. I think that there was that point made in a number of cases. As we mentioned earlier, I think there are disciplinary differences with regard to how things are accepted. I interviewed one psychologist who, she basically told me, if it's not in a peer-reviewed journal, that's it, end of story.
So, because the departments are determining what the P&T guidelines are going to be. And so, I don't know if it's in our slides or not, but I know I talked to one person, and we use in the report. This person basically says it's obvious that the institution values this stuff because they hire people to help coordinate it, they talk about it a lot, they get the Newsweek stuff. But the problem, they say exactly what you say, but the problem is all the decisions about P&T are made at the department level, right? And so they recognize that as a kind of issue.
It's an interesting differential between new faculty and older faculty that are already tenured too in terms of perception, because the new faculty, they come in, I got signed on to this place, this community-based stuff is great, and I know it's valued here, and then the other faculty, more senior faculty are saying, well, yeah, but.
There's also a disciplinary difference in conversation with community partners, and they would see, a pipeline from one discipline to their community partner, and some
What
of them,
discipline would that be?
it depended on the partner.
Would it be more likely to be social science and humanities and, say, natural sciences?
Yes and no, but it really depended on the partner, and some of them voiced a desire to have people from other disciplines coming to meet other needs because they saw their challenges in the community as needing multiple lenses.
They've got some interdisciplinary areas that are emerging, and when I talk to people, they were also not sure how their interdisciplinary areas fit. So they have a community health program that's emerging. They have an urban studies program that's emerging that now has a director, and those programs cut across traditional disciplines. So I talked to a biologist who's doing work with St. Jude, right, and sort of thinking about that. Probably said more than we're supposed to, not that we're out of time.
Great. Where's the Capstone fit in here? Isn't the Capstone project, this whole activity, part of scholarship of engagement? Remember we used that?
Oh, yeah, I'd say this is.
Yeah, so it comes full circle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.